You're watching VinylicPumaGaming. What's up, guys? Today, I wanted to go ahead and talk about Fallout 4's Great War and if it could actually happen to us today or possibly in the future. What's interesting about Fallout is that in certain ways, it parallels our own real world. Granted, it's not totally exact, as there was a divergence sometime after World War II, but many of the alliances that were formed after World War II exist within Fallout's universe. I think one of the most notable things that the Fallout franchise predicted was the eventual rise of China being the world's second most powerful economy, only surpassed by the United States. But we're here to talk about the Great War and whether it could happen or not. But before we do that, I think it's important that we discuss the events that led up to the Great War within the Fallout universe. The Great War was one of several wars that were a part of the Resource Wars. Most of these wars revolved around several different countries competing over oil. The Resource Wars began in 2052 as a conflict between Europe and the Middle East, and a few months after this initial conflict started, the United Nations was officially disbanded. The very first nuclear bomb detonated after the UN disbanded was in Tel Aviv. Terrorists were able to obtain a nuclear weapon and used it to destroy Tel Aviv, located in Israel. The very next month, in January 2054, a small nuclear exchange occurs in the Middle East between European and Middle Eastern powers. That ultimately results in the U.S. enacting Project Safehouse, which led to the funding and creation of the vaults within the Fallout universe. After about 8 years of fighting, war between Europe and the Middle East ends as the Middle East runs out of oil. Both Europe and the Middle East are left in ruins, while what remains of Europe dissolves into several different nations, all competing for what's left of Europe's oil supplies. A year before the end of the European and Middle Eastern conflict in 2059, the United States sets up defenses in Alaska to protect the state's oil resources from China. In 2066, China invades Alaska, starting the battle for Anchorage. During the Anchorage campaign, the USS Ebon Atoll was sunk by another U.S. vessel called the USS Interference. The Ebon Atoll was shot with a nuclear torpedo, which killed all personnel on board. After 11 years of fighting, the U.S. finally managed to reclaim Anchorage. However, in October of that year, a nuclear exchange occurred between the U.S. and China, thus starting the Great War and ending civilization in the Fallout universe. About 90 years later, the events of the very first Fallout game began. Something that you'll notice is that there were 3 nuclear attacks that occurred before the Great War. The first being the terrorists in Tel Aviv, the second being the European and Middle Eastern powers, and during their little nuclear exchange, and the third being a mistake by the US military firing on one of its own ships. This begs the question, if all of these countries are so trigger-happy in the Fallout universe, could today's governments trigger a Great War of their own? Now keep in mind that the Great War was a part of and ultimately a conclusion to the Resource Wars. For that reason, I would say that the more important question is, could the Resource Wars happen in our own world or timeline? As I'm sure many of you know, various countries in our real world are competing for oil right now. While I won't get too much into geopolitics, the vast majority of the world's oil supply resides in the Middle East, as well as the African countries of Algeria, Libya, and Nigeria, along with the South American country of Venezuela. Apparently, there is also a significant amount of oil located in Indonesia as well. The Middle East in particular is where most of the world's oil supply currently resides. Because the world economy is built around the idea of having a substantial oil supply for various cars and various other petroleum-based products, this ultimately leads to competing interests amongst nations in the Middle East and around the world. Generally speaking, it's safe to say that if a war is occurring in the Middle East, it is probably over oil. In the Fallout universe, the Resource Wars happened because there was a scarcity in the world's oil supply. This resulted with countries attempting to secure oil supplies they control and try to take oil supplies from other nations through military action. We ultimately see this as a conflict between Europe and the Middle East, as well as the United States and China. Europe took military action against the Middle East because of the high oil prices, while China invaded the U.S. state of Alaska to get its hands on the United States oil supply. If oil were to become a scarce enough resource and the demand for oil was high enough, I think any country in our modern world today would go to war for it. Now, something that's interesting is that the resource wars in Fallout's universe began about in the 2050s, about 2052 or so. According to a Stanford business article published in 2008, the article reads, and I quote, "According to calculations by Gilbert Masters, Stanford professor of civil and environmental engineering, current oil supplies in all nations combined would last the world for only about 41 years. Now, a more modern article written in 2014, featured in USA Today, had oil company BP predict that the world's oil supply would deplete roughly 53 years from 2014. The beginning paragraph reads, quote, BP has provided an intriguing update to its global oil reserves estimate in the company's latest yearly review of energy statistics. BP raised its reserve estimate by 1.1% to 1,687.9 billion barrels, which is enough oil to last the world 53.3 years at the current production rates. While both articles do indicate that the oil industry is always finding more ways to drill for oil, the Stanford article predicts the world's oil supply will end in about 2049, while the USA Today article predicts that the world's oil supply will end in the year 2067. These trends do appear to be eerily similar to the Fallout universe, give or take about 10 years. There are about 9 countries right now that we know, or at least think, have nuclear weapons. They are the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. Of all of the countries mentioned, the United States and Russia are the only 2 countries confirmed to have what is called a nuclear triad. This is where nuclear bombs can be delivered by land, air, and sea. Now, it hasn't been confirmed, but it's suspected that China and Israel also have nuclear triads. In today's society, a nuclear exchange between either the United States and Russia is more likely than a nuclear exchange between the US and China. Now, at the same time, and I guess geopolitically, a lot can happen in about 30 to 50 years from now. It's possible that several countries in both the Middle East and around the world could develop their own arsenals of nuclear weapons. It's also possible that many countries right now may have scientists that know how to develop nuclear weapons, but they haven't done so out of fear of military action from the more prominent nuclear powers across the globe. For example, while China and the United States don't always get along, they do agree on preventing other countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. This is because if 2 countries were to go to war and both of these countries had an arsenal of nuclear weapons, the conflict between both countries would end with nuclear war. Make no mistake of that. Even if both countries started out not using nuclear weapons at all, nuclear weapons would eventually be used. So now that we've established that the Great War could possibly happen in our own timeline, we need to discuss the severity of nuclear war. If nuclear war were to ever break out, it seems unlikely to me that the events of the Fallout franchise could occur. As an example, I will demonstrate the difference between the Little Boy and the Tsar Bomba exploding in Washington, D.C. using a website called NUKEMAP, and there will be a link to this website in the description. As we all know, the United States dropped the Little Boy on Hiroshima in the year 1945. According to NUKEMAP, the Little Boy bomb would wipe out a significant portion of Washington, D.C. However, much of the area seems like it would remain intact. So, as far as Fallout 3 is concerned, I would say it would be possible for Fallout 3 to happen if a nuclear weapon on par with the Little Boy bomb was detonated. According to NUKEMAP, 120,000 people would be killed by the blast, while the rest may succumb to fallout and terrible weather conditions as a result of the nuclear winter. On the other hand, the Russian-built Tsar Bomba, which is the most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated, is more than 3,000 times more powerful than the Little Boy that was dropped on Hiroshima. As you can see on the NUKEMAP display, the Tsar Bomba would totally obliterate Washington, D.C. There would be nothing left. No Lincoln Memorial, no Congress building, no Jefferson Memorial, no Project Purity, nothing. Even worse, significant areas outside of Washington, D.C. would be affected, and the effects could be felt as far away as Baltimore, Maryland. According to NUKEMAP, 2,273,000 people would be killed by a Tsar Bomba bomb if it was dropped in Washington, D.C. Almost 20 times as many people that were killed by the Little Boy bomb. Now, granted, the Tsar Bomba was the most powerful nuclear weapon ever built, and feasibly no other weapon has been built since that's quite as powerful. At the same time, weaker bombs, especially in the 5 megaton and up range, would totally obliterate Washington, D.C. Imagine if hundreds of Tsar Bombas were falling across the United States. Not only would you be dead, your family would be dead, and possibly everyone you ever knew or would eventually ever meet would be dead as well. While I suppose there's a remote possibility someone would survive a nuclear exchange, I don't think they would survive the nuclear winter that would later ensue. Maybe if you had access to a vault you could survive, but you would need to be in a remote area like Wyoming, where no big cities are. After all, most big cities are going to be wiped out, and if the bomb is on par with the Tsar Bomba, you're going to want to be well outside of the city limits, preferably 50 miles or more. Ultimately, it greatly depends on the strengths of the bombs used. Since it's been over 100 years since the end of World War II by the time the bombs are dropping in game, it's fair to say that both China and the United States would have nuclear weapons that are way stronger than what appears in our own timeline. Both China and the US would be able to drop 100 bombs that could even be more powerful than the Tsar Bomba. So could the Great War happen? Well, let's just say, let's hope it doesn't. Alright guys, that's going to pretty much wrap up this particular video. Let me know if you like this video. Please be sure to leave a like, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.